for those in the audience, thank you for joining us in this small, intimate group, and for those who are watching the recording. What I wanted to do is step back and, beyond the introduction that Gary offered, just offer a little bit more context about myself, because it's relevant to this presentation. As was mentioned, I'm the Dean of the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies, which is the center, but not the owner, of lifelong learning at the University of Chicago. And as higher education is evolving, one thing we know is that lifelong learning is becoming more, not less important for universities, especially as they try to show their societal relevance. As well as here in my role as Dean, I can say that we are at an inflection point for higher education that is not dissimilar to that which we saw 125 years ago. And 125 years ago, actually this academic year, these two gentlemen, the portly gentleman on the left was the founding president of the University of Chicago, a gentleman named William Rainey Harper. The gentleman here on my right, you probably don't know by sight, but certainly probably know by name, was John D. Rockefeller, who was the individual who helped endow and basically establish the University of Chicago. And we're at an inflection point for a variety of reasons, but one other thing I want to mention about this story that might not be apparent to you if you don't know the history of UChicago well, is that the amazing thing about Harper is he was what I actually described in my own academic work, an institutional entrepreneur, right? It was not that Rockefeller set out immediately necessarily to found a university, nor did he immediately set out to found it in a place that he had never really spent much time, Chicago. But it was Harper's vision, it was Harper's passion for what a university could and should be that drove Rockefeller to help establish what is now arguably one of the world's leading universities. Why is that relevant beyond the fact that Graham was actually founded as part of that same narrative? So unlike any other university up until that point, the University of Chicago was established with three main component parts. The university proper, which basically meant the college, university extension, which meant distance and lifelong learning, and the university press. What was remarkable about that was that when Harper set out that vision, there was no other extension unit in the United States and only one other extension unit in the world, and that was at Cambridge. Being an entrepreneur, Harper very quickly recruited the head of Cambridge entrepreneurship under the guise of doing a one-year stint in Chicago, a man named Richard Moulton, who ended up staying at the university for 25 years. Beyond the importance for Graham, though, I would suggest that this story also has a lot of resonance here in the Indian context. Because what the University of Chicago represented, along with Stanford, Johns Hopkins, Cornell, and MIT, were the founding of newly established private institutions which both would model and push the existing established institutions, the Yales, the Harvards, and the Princetons of the world. And now, having spent enough time here in India and having visited with both the established public as well as the newly founded private, I think it's fair to say that we are at an inflection point, not just for global higher ed broadly, but also here in India. And Bala and I, in our travels, I think, have seen this through all our interaction with institutions like Ashoka and Manipal, as well as the public institutions, and recognize that the forces that drove these two gentlemen to help set up what became a model of the 20th century research university is now driving the 21st century research university. And what are those forces? There's four to name, and I just want to walk through those quickly, talk about how Graham then responds to those in terms of the broader context, and then leave it time for any questions or comments or just socialization. First of these forces, and then the last point I do want to say, I always forget, I usually walk through this slide, but for this group, I think it's important. We know this because we work in this space. But as you think about the value chain of higher education, the students we serve, the faculty who teach, the curriculum as it's developed, the credentials that are offered, and then what it even means to be affiliated with an institution, all of these things changed quite dramatically in that period I just talked about, and they are under some change today. Those like Daphne Kohler and Anant Agarwal of Coursera and edX might say that we're undergoing a period of disruption. I would disagree with that. I think this is much more of an evolution. But the key point here is that higher education is changing, and there are forces that are driving that change. The first of these is simple demographics. right? If you think about us at Graham as being the center of lifelong learning, this is actually a very heartening statistic, which it points out for the first time in human history, we will have more people over the age of 65, we just passed this recently in 2012, than under the age of 5. And this is globally. But what it also means, and we're experiencing this in our own programs, is that academic journeys are no longer as linear as they once were, right? What we see instead is that individuals are coming in and out of the higher education system. So for example, at Graham, we offer professional master's degrees, newly emerging multidisciplinary fields where we can bring theory and practice together. Analytics, biomedical informatics, threat and response and risk management. In those programs, we just did an analysis, more than half of the graduates of those programs have come back to school after earning either a PhD or some other master's degree, right? And what that speaks to us, and what it suggests to, I think, anyone interested in the higher education ecosystem, is we are seeing a period where learning is no longer about just one's age between 18 and 22 for undergrad or 25 and 34 for graduate school. And as we see higher education evolve, this fact is going to become more and more important. It's also going to be enhanced by a few other factors. First, the push towards urbanization. For the University of Chicago, I think this, again, is a very good development because it speaks to our strengths. The University of Chicago, again, was founded in the city, unlike a lot of other schools which are now urban. So let's take Columbia or Harvard or Yale, having gone to Yale. Those schools were actually founded and then cities eventually developed around them. Chicago was very consciously placed in the city. The other thing I would note about this is that this phenomenon is one that we continue to see grow apace. So in 1950, according to the UN, 34% of all global citizens lived in an urban setting. As of 2014, that number was up to 54%, and by 2050, the expectation is over 2/3 of all citizens will live in an urban context. Urbanization isn't simply a force driving a number of economic factors. It's also a force, as we see it, that is going to drive more and more demand and access to education and higher education. So the advent or the demographic shifts we see in terms of the population, urbanization are two things that are driving changes in the higher education ecosystem. The third force, and I think this is obvious for any of us who are here, is globalization, right? And what's notable about all three of these forces, interestingly enough, is that these are forces that drove the advent of the research university at the beginning of the 20th century. With demography in the US, it wasn't aging, it was instead the increase of population, the rapid increase of population given the waves of immigrants. In terms of urbanization, it was a move away from the farms into the city. Not at the scale we've seen globally recently, but certainly at a large scale. And in terms of globalization, what's interesting is that in the higher education context from 1890 to 1920, that first big push when the modern research university was established, American universities needed to find their place in the world and did so with reference to the UK and Germany. Now what is happening as a country and as a society in America, we recognize that American universities have to find their way in the context of the whole world. Hence, for the University of Chicago, our commitment to the Asia-Pacific region, the establishment of the center here in Delhi, the establishment of a center in Beijing, the establishment and growth of a center in Hong Kong. All of those things reflect this force, that education, especially in the modern context, is being driven more and more beyond national boundaries to have to incorporate a global ethos to truly be as impactful and effective as it wants to be. And accelerating all of these trends is the last one, technology. And forgive me for spending a little bit extra time here, but as I said, I came from the private sector, and my last two roles in the private sector were at firms which looked at the impact of technology in society, one on business, the other on education. The impact of technology on higher education has three major component parts, if you think about it in the context of online education. One, it has an impact upon credentialing, right? No longer is it simply about degrees. And I can go in chapter and verse and happy to answer questions about the concept of nanodegrees or badges or bridging programs. But that's not the only thing that technology offers us. Technology also offers us a very unique opportunity to really focus on student engagement. How are students engaging with content, not just in a purely online format, but in a hybrid and blended format as well. And lastly, and I think in some ways this is the most challenging for us, but one that we at the Graham School are helping the University of Chicago experiment with, is how does online learning impact actual teaching itself? How does the prospect of technology impact pedagogy? That in and of itself is a very important question. And I would say when you hear most of the public conversation around online learning, it really only focuses on that first piece, right? The credentialing aspect or the scale of it in regards to massive open online courses, MOOCs. But I would argue that the real potential in terms of online learning is not as something separate or replacing traditional education. It's as something that enhances the best of that traditional education in terms of engagement and in terms of pedagogy. And we've done some experiments already at the Graham School that I'm happy to talk about. But what I would emphasize in that regard is that the mistake that was made in business is the mistake we see a lot of institutions make in higher education as well. And I say this not currently as dean, but as someone who consulted those institutions, where they mistake technology for strategy. They take courses online for no other reason than to say they're doing online learning. In our context, the University of Chicago, we've actually been slow to move into this space because we realize that the only reason why you should embrace a technology is because it enhances or can extend your core values. And that's what we are seeking to do. The other really, really subtle but important element in online learning and the advents we're seeing in education, and I was just speaking at Ashoka to, how many, it was about 20 students today about this, is that it is incredibly liberating for a student in this day and age to grow up in an era where there are so many resources available to them. On the other hand, it is massively daunting because the path is no longer as clear as it once was, right? Sometimes there are too many choices available. And when we're thinking about online learning, I see students who are literally overwhelmed and paralyzed by the options in front of them, and so sometimes fail to take advantage of all of the resources they can use potentially, or aren't understanding how those resources can put together. The term I use is we're moving from an educational experience which was very linear to one that, in the case of many students, needs to be self-curated, right? As students, for example, from a place like India are applying to American graduate schools, it's one thing to say, yes, I'm going to go through a formal program, but we see students now mentioning what MOOCs they took, right? Or what short courses they took online as a way of trying to boost their portfolio. And the challenge with that is that it's not necessarily something that is naturally directed. And right, so how students self-pace and self-curate is going to become more and more important as technology expects more and more self-direction from the students. The last thing I would mention in regards to technology and in regards to learning is that at its most sort of accentuated, especially in the United States, but I think around the world, there was this argument that the modern university was going to cease to be relevant, was going to cease to be important. Everyone would be curating their own learning. Why would they bother with degrees? Why would they bother with credentials? And I think that was an overstatement on a number of levels. And the most ready analogy I can liken it to is when the internet first popped in 1996, right? By 2000, you had a number of individuals saying retail stores will cease to exist. Right? No longer will we ever go to a shop. We will only order online and things will come to us. Well, what happened? The irony is e-commerce ended up being bigger than anyone predicted. But at the same time, retail continued to grow. And so instead of being singular in terms of the channel, we saw the advent of multi-channel commerce. I would suggest that's where we're going to see a lot of education go as well. Not in any one linear path, but a multi-channel path where institutions like the University of Chicago will remain very much tertiary, but then use online learning and other elements at either end of the long tail. First, as a vehicle for talent identification. One of the potentials which we haven't taken advantage of yet, but we're seeking to think about how we use it, is how do you use online courses as a way for an institution to better vet prospective applicants? On the other end of the tail, and where we have had some success, is right now when you graduate from university, your educational experience and affiliation with that university, for the most part, ends. We at Graham, working with alumni relations, have said, why does it have to be the case? And have actually built out a whole alumni platform with specific courses dedicated for UChicago alumni, which has actually seen some pretty significant uptick. To be a leading university, one needs to be relevant. To be relevant in this era requires a robust lifelong learning strategy. 50 years ago, leading institutions did not need a lifelong learning strategy necessarily. It was a nice to have, not a need to have. In this era, though, if you are going to be relevant as a university, you need to have a lifelong learning strategy. And so as the Center of Lifelong Learning, we've built out a robust strategy. And I've talked about all of these, but let me walk through them because I think it's just at least important giving some context to all we do and how we can potentially partner with those in India and elsewhere in the world. First, we extend the reach of the university through professional studies programs. Right? These are newly emerging, multidisciplinary fields where we can bring theory and practice together. Second, and this is where we most often partner with foreign institutions, is we bridge the various gaps that exist within higher education's ecosystem, creating new points of entry and new on-ramps. We do this through our Graduate Student at Large program, which is a remarkably interesting program that allows students to experience graduate study without fully committing to a course of study, as well as through our summer session, which offers numerous opportunities for people to come on campus to the University of Chicago, to do various experiential learning programs throughout the United States. And just this year, we're launching a program called Arts and Sciences, which is teaching high school students critical thinking skills. We're doing it in Chicago, but we're also doing it in Beijing and in Bangalore. Third, and this is very interesting from the UChicago context, is that most lifelong learning units across the world have pretty much focused on the partnership piece or the professional studies piece. We, along with only, I think, really Stanford, are still committed to lifelong learning in the liberal arts. So that's the great books of the Western heritage. That's offering opportunities for students who are older in life, who maybe went in a professional course of study to come back and study in a more humanities-based way, and we do that in a number of different programs. And then lastly, and this actually would cut across all of those lines there, we also are, as a unit that is working in a lifelong context, committed to experimentation and innovation. And experimenting and innovating in those areas that are of strategic importance to the University of Chicago. And the evergreen areas that are always of importance to us as a university are how do we engage with our civic locale and with our urban environment? How do we engage globally? Because the University of Chicago is committed to being a global university. And how do we engage with our alumni? I've talked about all of those in an overview, but I think it would just be helpful to, as this group thinks about sort of itself, and as we think about the University of Chicago, to really understand that one of the beauties of Graham is that much of higher education, and this is one of its great strengths, is faculty driven, right? At the University of Chicago, programs are designed around what faculty interests are. What Graham seeks to do is say, given those faculty interests, what are the needs of the students and what are the programmatic needs, and how can we make those work in a way that might not fit the traditional context of higher education, but still is of the same quality of inquiry and can have the same, if not greater, impact. So with that, I just want to thank you for your time and your attention.